am expecting Secretary Moore to be able to join at about 3 o'clock, but we have a quorum now. So let's get started. Welcome to the Vermont Climate Council Science and Data Committee for August 18th, I believe. Sorry for getting started a little late here, but we'll just dive right in. On the agenda today is a discussion of the greenhouse gas inventory review. Jared sent around a little earlier overview of the task group recommendation, and we'll have some discussion of that and talk about how we move that recommendation to the full council. And before we finalize anything, we'll do some public comment on it. And then also the social cost of carbon report, overview of the report comments and the revisions to the draft report from David Hill. And also I sent around a draft task group recommendation on that issue. And similarly, we may be able to put that, if there's agreement, to the full council. Public comment and task group updates. We did have a request. I think you all were copied on it from Secretary Moore to flip-flop the schedule so that we talk about the social cost of carbon first, so she can participate more fully in the greenhouse gas inventory review, even if we start talking about it before she can get on. She's at the mercy of the legislature, who rescheduled a hearing for this afternoon. Without regard to our subcommittee. So are there any objections to flipping that agenda?
Sounds good.
Hearing none, before we move into the social cost of carbon, the minutes for the August 11th meeting were linked in the agenda and in the email that was sent around earlier. Does anybody have any corrections to the minutes? Right. Thank you. We'll consider those approved. And let's dive right into the social cost of carbon report revisions, and I'll turn it over straight away to David to go over the comments he received and revisions to the report.
Thank you, TJ. I'm sharing my screen now, so that should.
Yep, we can see that thing. Yep.
Everybody able to see it?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so thanks everybody. What we wanted to do today was to review the response to comments and the edits that we've made to the report. We'll be able to send out there's a revised version of the report out based on these comments, and then also to have a brief discussion on the decision points for the Science and Data Subcommittee. So I will go through this relatively quickly. I'm not sure if everyone has been on the calls before. For those of you that have, this just reviews the scope of work that we had for task 3A and 3B, which included the review of the state's existing cost of carbon reduction model and calculations. So there were several different specific activities that we wanted to do under that task that are listed there, comparing them to reviewing existing assumptions and measures, identifying any gaps, and then think about the way in which this information can be incorporated into the LEAP model to support the climate action plan. Separately, the social cost of carbon or carbon dioxide equivalent, and a discount rate for use in the economic analysis of mitigation strategies for the climate action plan. We reviewed the literature for both the methods that are used based on damage and abatement cost methods for calculating the social cost of carbon or other greenhouse gases. We conducted a polling exercise with members of the Data and Science Subcommittee on July 21st, and we report on that. So the methods that we used were to review the model and the workbooks in detail. As I said, literature review on future costs and depths of savings and potentially adoption curves so that we can incorporate those into the modeling going forward. Looking at the damage and abatement cost methods for the social cost of carbon and other greenhouse gases, and then looking at the sensitivity for discount rates to the results for social cost of carbon accounting. And as I mentioned, we also did the polling exercise with members of attendees of the July 21st meeting, which we reported on. So comments and edits, we did an overview of the task 3 report. I think it was it just last week? Yeah, last Wednesday. We gave an overview of those results. And so what I'm reporting on today really are comments and edits that we received after that on each of the components, and just discuss briefly how we addressed those in the revised report. So one of the important ones was it's a little bit confusing in some of the literature and even in some of the technical support document from the Federal Interagency Working Group and in the New York Department of Environmental Conservation. Everyone is not exactly clear all the time when they're talking about a cost of carbon estimates, whether they're talking about CO2e and including other greenhouse gases. Jared, I offered a suggestion that we make it clear that we think going forward, the cost of carbon reduction model, as well as Vermont's accounting for the social cost of carbon, should be expanded to include other greenhouse gases as appropriate and as information is available, so that you're not just looking at measures that only reduce CO2, but that measures that reduce say the leakage of fluorinated gases or reduced methane, direct methane emissions can be captured as well and reflected in a social cost or in the cost of reduction on a CO2e basis. So it's the cost of greenhouse gas reductions, emissions reductions on a CO2e basis. Another comment that we received was that some of the review, the language was talking about the perspective of the cost of carbon reduction model in terms of its societal costs. And that we revised that to use the term resource costs as opposed to societal costs, because in societal cost tests, sometimes you're including other elements, and the cost of carbon reduction model currently is looking really at the resource costs that are involved in the reduction and the emissions reductions. So it's not currently a full societal cost accounting. It's more of the resource cost test for those that are familiar with different tests that are used for cost benefit analysis. But it's equivalent to or consistent with what would be called the resource costs. And so we revised that language some. The third bullet, because of some of the discussion that this group has had related to life cycle and upstream emissions reductions, we felt that it was appropriate in this report to the term life cycle, measure life cycle was being used when it really was referring to a measure lifetime. So the emissions reductions over an individual measure's lifetime. And so we clarified that using measure lifetime in place of life cycle, as we've discussed with this group and others. The life cycle has further implications in terms of embedded emissions that are happening upstream or in different places, not just related to an individual measure and its emissions over the course of its useful life. There's a discussion in the report of the use of a 2% discount rate to be used for the social cost of carbon. And we wanted to clarify that that is recommendation for, the time being and based on kind of the current state of affairs, but that it should be open to updates. The Federal Interagency Working Group is due to have a report by the beginning of by the end of this year, that will revisit and is looking explicitly at the potential of using lower discount rates than have been used in the past. Recognizing that both due to the nature of the return on, basically the return on investments in the market and bonds and other things, discount rates, and then also the updated science on the damages and things that are going on. The discount rate should be open to updates, and it may likely change over time. So it's a 2% discount rate used for currently, but subject to change as further updates are available. That next bullet again talks about the resource cost of carbon or CO2 equivalent reduction perspective. And so again, considering not from the customer's financial perspective, but more from the resource costs for the state economy, what are the costs associated with various reduction measures and their equivalent emissions reductions on a CO2 basis, CO2e basis. We recommended that some measures, that additional measures could be added to the model over time. And we wanted to make it clear that that different measure types and groups will have varying levels of requirements in terms of how easy or difficult they are to characterize and include into the model. So some may be relatively easy and can be addressed rather quickly, and others may take more time. So there's some language in the section that discusses specific recommendations on those measures that helps to clarify that. And then finally, on this slide, the last bullet there, the support for the pathways analysis is also then addressing kind of the depth and the pace of savings for individual measures. So in the coming 5 years or in the period between now and 2030 or through 2050, what types of pace and depth of savings are available from each measure? That's not information that's in the current model, and that will be that's important to include in the LEAP modeling, and it's important from, it's work that is also supported by what EAN has done work on the pathways analysis, and that is included in the LEAP model currently. And our team will be helping to review and address those assumptions as we go forward with the analysis of the pathways. Let me stop there. I've got a few more. I will stop there to see if there are questions or comments on those. And then there's a few more related to the cost of carbon reduction model review. But let me just pause for any questions or comments.
Thanks for the presentation, David. And I know that it can be difficult to capture kind of nuanced topics in bullet points with a limited amount of words, but I just want, for folks who are not as kind of in-depth focused on this, I wanted to pause just to clarify for the full group and anybody who may be joining from the public, just to clarify those second and fifth bullet points related to the recommendations around resource costs. Yep. I'll just offer my interpretation, my understanding of what I think, where I think you're landing, but if you can please just make sure that I've got that correct.
Sure.
And that is to say that when you say, for instance, in the second bullet point, use resource costs as opposed to societal costs, it's really just the report acknowledging that the current cost of carbon reduction model that the Public Service Department has developed uses resource costs for its analysis and workbook. It's not a recommendation that that should be used instead of or above societal costs. It's just that they have not developed a societal cost analysis yet for that tool. But I do think it's probably worth clarifying that, you know, because we're developing a social cost of carbon, we're going to have increased ability to assess not just the resource cost as that model currently does, but be able to look at societal costs as well, which we also want to do. So I just think it's important to clarify that second bullet point, that it's not one over the other. It's just resource costs is how that model has been built and used to date.
That's correct, Jared, and thank you. I was not clear on that, and I think that that's very helpful. So yes, it's really referring to the current characterization of the way the model is, the current costs that the model is using, and as we have more information on social cost of carbon or other non-energy benefits and other things that may not be in there, you can incorporate more of a societal cost perspective. Yes. Okay, I will continue through here. This relates to the next point as well. We added some language, making sure to indicate that just because non-energy benefits may be hard to quantify, and that we also added language that the quantification of non-energy benefits is perhaps best done at a programmatic or measure level as part of, you know, the development of programs and cost effectiveness and program plans, et cetera. Proposals for exactly how to do those non-energy benefits are typically done at a more kind of more the ground level for those activities, and rather than across, say, for the climate action plan at a higher level. But it's important to recognize that just because non-energy benefits sometimes are hard to quantify, that should not mean that they're just set equal to zero, which is sometimes a default in analyses. So recognizing that there are efforts underway to characterize and quantify the non-energy benefits from different measures, and then look to incorporate those into the analysis where there is say programmatic or individual measure type characterizations of those is important. The next bullet discusses how the customer financial perspective will influence. So when you look at the customer's perspective, say for the opportunity to switch a heating system, then the retail rates that customer sees for their fuels, their current fuel use, and potentially for the electric rates that they would see if they were to switch to a heat pump, those do have an influence and are very important in terms of the customer's likelihood to adopt that measure, the need for incentives to help encourage them to adopt that measure. The savings that they will see, the savings and costs that they see are based on the retail rates. In addition, avoided costs that take more of the state's, a state level resource cost perspective. So avoided costs for electric supply rather than the retail rates, or the avoided costs for fuels rather than the retail rates. Those are more appropriate and helpful to analyze and compare and contrast mitigation strategies at the state level. So they can be informed by the customer's financial perspective and the retail rates. But it's important to recognize that both of those perspectives and that both of those types of analysis have their proper place. And so in the cost of carbon reduction model review, there were places where retail rates are used, and then others where there are avoided costs used. And we just want to clarify that it's not that you should always be using avoided costs or always just be using retail rates, but to be clear about the benefit that those different perspectives can have under different circumstances and conditions. And there is a need for a number of there are, let's say, inputs or assumptions that are embedded in something like the cost of carbon reduction model that are not static, they're dynamic. So, and these can include not just costs over time, the savings over time as different interactive effects take place and measures develop, but also just technical factors such as the solar coincidence factor. So as you get more and more solar on the grid, the coincidence, the solar coincidence with peak is likely to change. And that can also be influenced by the adoption of heat pumps or electric vehicles and those types of things. So it's important to maintain and update the technical factors as well as the cost and other assumptions that are in the model as you go forward. So let me stop again there. I will switch next to the comments on the social cost of carbon and the discount rate piece of the work, but see if there are any other questions or clarifications. Okay.
No questions from me, David, but I just want
Yep.
to say thank you to you and your team for being really responsive to comments that were received and thoughtful in how you address them.
Sure. No,
Thank you.
you're very welcome. Once again, Liz Bourget is on the phone with me, and she and I worked together on addressing a number of the comments. And then also we had Chris Nemi and Gabrielle Stebbins from our team also contributed to the edit. So thank you to everybody for turning these around relatively quickly. But yeah, hopefully we were able to address all the comments, and we appreciate we think that they were very helpful in improving the report. So comments on the social cost of carbon and the discount rate, a little bit, I think there were fewer of these. Excuse me. The first one, as I said, it is a little bit confusing in the literature, and I haven't seen it necessarily completely well addressed. The social cost of carbon, say the interagency working group technical support document that came out in February of this year, which is one of the reports we cite, estimates a social cost for carbon, a social cost for methane, and a social cost for nitrous oxide. It also discusses the social cost for greenhouse gases, presumably then in a CO2e denominator, but it doesn't make that entirely clear. So the ways to approach this, I think the best way probably to approach this is for us to adopt, recognize that we want to have a social cost for CO2e and incorporate reductions of not just carbon, but the other gases as well in computing that. It would be also possible to go through, although I think the literature is less well developed, the social cost of carbon, as we mentioned, uses the integrated assessment models and multiple runs on these different models using the damage-based control. That can be done, and or you can use an abatement cost method, say for nitrous oxide and methane. It starts to get a little bit complicated if we start using perhaps a damage-based methodology for one gas and an abatement cost method for another gas, but it's possible. What I would recommend right now is expand the definition for the social cost of carbon to be CO2e and account for the emissions of all gases when applying that in the economic analysis. That's a mouthful, so let me stop there just to see if there's discussion or questions on that.
Yes, I want to be clear. So are you essentially recommending to convert the emissions of methane, for instance, to a carbon equivalent and then applying that social cost of carbon value?
Yes.
Yeah. Just
Yeah,
thank
rather
you. I
than
just wanted to say
having-
it back to you. So thank you.
Yes, yeah. Thank you.
And I wonder, David, if this may be similar to, the bullet point 4 on this slide in terms of the discount rate, another place where we want to say, this is the recommendation for now, pending, further updates in terms of the best
That's science. Yes.
available information, given that the interagency working group will likely have further guidance on this coming out in the next year.
Yeah, and there's a slide that I want to show. The next slide actually kind of underscores needing to stay open to updates. So yes, I agree with that. And I'll share that in a minute about the number of studies and what's being learned as we go along compared to the studies and the data that are available that are in the current models that are being used. There's a lot of new science coming out, and as people have from the IPCC reports and others, some of the impacts are running, many of the impacts are running ahead of what the models actually would suggest, and so that could lead to significant updates in terms of damage-based cost estimation and assessments. I used the term deliberative polling at the beginning of this, and I recognize that we really didn't have enough of a process and really didn't provide kind of deliberative polling, does some polling and then tries to help provide further information to do kind of multiple rounds of polling and stuff. So I don't think that was really an appropriate, it's a good comment that it wasn't necessarily an appropriate use of the term. And so we just changed it to the Science and Data Subcommittee polling exercise, which is a very exciting title. So, but I think it more accurately reflects what we did. And also that we wanted to make it clear that the Science and Data Subcommittee members that participated in the poll, there were 5, basically in terms of those responses were consistent with the response from the larger group, which was a larger number of 15. So both very small, but indicative, and these results are also consistent, as we note in the report, with the findings and recommendations that came out from the Synapse Avoided Energy Supply Cost Study for the region, with what was adopted by the New York State for guidelines for assessment of greenhouse gas emissions in New York State as well. And they're consistent with some of the work that the Federal Interagency Working Group is looking to update. So all of these are consistent with this 2% discount rate. So we do recommend that for the time being, and but open to updates, maintain flexibility. And this next slide is something that I took from the technical support document from February 2021. These 3 models are the 3 integrated assessment models that are have been the foundation of what the Interagency Working Group is using for their damage-based global assessments. And you can see that these studies, the studies that are incorporated in those models are dated now, and that there's an increase in the number of studies on climate impacts. There's much more research that's going on, and this is not even, this is only through 2015, but there's a lot of new science and information that's coming out. So while these models have done the best that they can, and they do represent kind of the best science that's out there in terms of integrated assessment models, there's a vast literature and numbers of studies that are coming out that are likely to influence and or change. And in many cases, the impacts, as I said, the impacts or the rate of change in some of the systems is perhaps has been faster than expected or than projected in models. So it's not as though the recommendations that we make today will be appropriate to maintain locked in stone going forward. With that in mind, this is I shared this last time, but this would be the table that we would look at. And then this gives basically the value at CO2 in the New York State report. It's per metric ton of CO2, and they do not discuss the other gases. It does not discuss whether this is CO2e that would be applied to the other gases. But presumably this is the value of a ton of emissions this is the future discounted value for a ton of emissions in 2020 is $121, and then those go up over time. So this is the value of avoided emissions or the damage caused by a 1 ton of CO2e emissions based on a 2% discount rate is in that middle column, what they call the average central rate. New York State, for the information of decision makers, actually indicated that they wanted to have all 3 of these discount rates presented. So they are using the 2% discount rate, but they present a table. They are recommending the use of a table that includes even a 0% discount rate. And you can see that obviously, I mean, this is by what, a factor of 5 over 1%, or, you know, it's yeah, more than a factor of 10 greater than the 2% discount rate. So these were included in the earlier report, but that's just a reminder of where that stands. And then the last slide I wanted to share was just looking forward, how the work that now has been done, the EAN pathways, Excel model, work from the cross-sector mitigation working groups. We don't have that on here, but I think that that's another important source. The Public Service Department cost of carbon reduction Excel model, and then inputs that our team is working on, the Cadmus team is working on, to try to help provide additional inputs that reflect some of these into the LEAP modeling that Stockholm Environment Institute is doing. This will provide then a set of changes in economic spending, both on, say, fuels and capital equipment, related primarily to the energy sector, but not strictly limited there, to estimate the overall impact on the state economy using this as an input-output model that estimates direct, indirect, and induced spending by sector. It's Cynthia Kahn from Cadmus team is working on this model, and it's directional. It's not dynamic changes in spending over each year out into the future. It's kind of more of a one-time, high-level, directional set of economic results. Those who are familiar with different economic impact analysis models recognize that IMPLAN is in some ways more simple than other models, but also can give a good overview of the economic impacts and directional impacts of that. And all of these basically help to inform the climate action plan. And we anticipate over time that there will be feedbacks along each of these that may be used to help, you know, over time, both update models, change model assumptions, look at various scenarios, and that type of, all in the interest of trying to come up with the best kind of plan that can meet the requirements of the GWSA targets. So then, I'm sorry, I said I thought that was the last slide. I was neglecting that the discussion today also then our recommendations. This is from kind of the EFG team that worked on the task 3 and 3A report. For your consideration as a subcommittee, decision points, we're recommending, you know, you consider adopting the report as we've presented it and forward to the council for their information in terms of their decision making. Continue to use the cost of carbon reduction model as appropriate. and to provide inputs and or to cross-check inputs that are in the LEAP and the Climate Action Plan modeling, continue to maintain and improve that model, use a global damage-based estimation for the social cost of CO2e based on the New York DEC values that we shared in that table, and that the 2% discount rate be recommended as being consistent with some of the recent literature places this is being done, and it's also consistent with the polling results from the exercise that we did with this group. So that is the last slide.
So I have one question, but I want to open it up to if there's others that have questions. So hearing none for David, I just want to, I guess as a clarification, we've discussed the discount rate, the 2% discount rate in the context of the social cost of carbon.
Yeah.
And I just want to clarify, we haven't discussed discount rate in terms of kind of the time value of money, how that might be, applied separate from a social cost of carbon, and that,
Right.
the 2%, the central rate there was used in development of that stream of values. And I just want to, I don't know that we can, I just want to clarify that those are two different discount rates that may both be relevant, but we've only
Yes.
really been talked about one.
So, yeah, thank you, TJ. These are the values in this table that each ton in the future years. So avoiding emissions in 2030 of a ton is based on this estimate, and the 2% discount rate is $137. You could, and there are different, discount rates applied in different ways. You in an overall economic analysis, you could have a different discount rate that uses these values that are based on a 2% discount rate for the social cost of carbon and the damages associated with that, but then discount these values at a different rate when you're looking at, if there's a different appropriate discount rate that the state wants to use overall in terms of in the in-plan model or in the climate action plan model, it doesn't necessarily need to be the same as this 2% discount rate that was used to establish these values of carbon. You could argue that it could be or should be, but you could argue that it may also be different. So they're not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I just wanted to raise that. I don't think we have time to get into it today, but one of the ways that the state uses a discount rate is in energy efficiency screening. The Public Utility Commission has adopted historically a 3% discount rate.
Mm-hmm.
And it was often it was originally based on the 12-month weighted average of treasury bonds, right?
Yeah.
And it was adopted a while ago. There's other like that. You've referenced the avoided energy supply cost report, which a lot of climate program administrators use in New England, and they use a methodology that involves subtracting the average 30-year average inflation from the 30-year average of treasury bonds, and coincidentally, it comes to 2% right now if you do that. But I just wanted to kind of highlight
they're not
that's
the
a
same.
different methodology. It's like totally, that's like kind
Yes.
of like a financial methodology, whereas the social cost of carbon discount rate is much different. And
Yeah.
So
we have in the report, if people are interested, and people may have more or less interest in this, I recognize, but we reference some of the material. The New York State document does a very good job of discussing kind of the social cost of carbon and its importance for state decision-making. And then Resources for the Future also provides some very good background materials and information on the social cost of carbon and the discount rates associated with that. So those references are in the report if people are interested.
Thank you for that. Any other questions on this subject? On the report, I should say, there's another piece to the discussion here on the agenda. Hearing none, I want to move to the draft recommendation that the task group put together. You recall that the task group was myself and Jared primarily. Ken Jones has participated when he's available, but not in development of the draft recommendation. So what we've done, and we did the task group for the greenhouse gas inventory did this as well, is to, and I sent this out previously this morning, is to draft up a recommendation from this committee to the council. I'm trying to pull it up now here. Okay, can folks see a Word document here?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is almost identical. I made one little edit after I sent it to all of you, but if you see this, it essentially says this subcommittee has reviewed the report, and we recommend adoption of the report with regard to the social cost of carbon, and agree with its recommendations, forward it to the full council. For the cost of carbon review of the cost of carbon, we're forwarding it along, but actually don't think that the Climate Council needs to take specific action. And then we go specifically into recommendations here of the specific recommendations. And one, value greenhouse gas emissions costs and avoided costs, essentially mitigation costs, using the social cost of carbon, essentially adopting the recommendation of the central rate, the 2% rate. And the footnote there in number 1 is related to the carbon equivalent. I'll scroll down a little bit so folks can see that footnote. There we go. Where emissions other than carbon can and should be converted to carbon equivalent emissions to appropriate value, the cost of emissions or the benefit associated with mitigating. Recognize that there's a range of possible discount rates in the social cost of carbon, and again, adopt the 2% rate, and that it's recognizing it's one reasonable discount rate to reflect the time value of money, and then from society's perspective, and then plan for updating on a regular basis, really to David's point that he articulated today, and that is in the plan, that there's more to come in this in terms of how we collectively as society learn on and kind of revisit our own assumptions, so that we should update it on a regular basis. I'll just continue on briefly with the cost of carbon portion here, is that we recommend no further formal action from the council, but we suggest that the state should do the following. And it's kind of recognizing that it's a public service department report that is being reviewed here, but continue to maintain and update the accounting for mitigation pathways and that the model is one way to do it. And the EFG report actually calls for that model to continue to be updated, but that there's a lot of formats which that could be. And so there's this kind of, we don't necessarily need a Department of Public Service spreadsheet to do this. It could come in other ways, but that the meat of it should continue to exist, essentially. And then number two is to essentially develop a mitigation supply curve. And that one of the ideas in the report was to expand the cost of carbon to not only look at the kind of 1 year cost, but the future costs and the potential for different measures. And that would be in a mitigation supply curve. And so this is already part of the scope of work for EFG, and whether it's specific or kind of done in the context of LEAP, the LEAP modeling, but it is and kind of pulled out there to be explicit. But I think that just to regularly update kind of this mitigation supply curve and to have those recommendations for the state. But both of those things are things that, one, are either already happening, and two, that not necessarily appropriate for the Vermont Climate Council. And so that's where we've landed today, and I guess looking for feedback and questions or comments on these recommendations. And I'll open this, well, I'll ask subcommittee members first, and then even David, feel free to ask questions as well. And then before any decisions are made, I want to make sure we get full comment from the public as well. So I can't see everybody while I'm sharing the screen, so I just speak up, or hey, Jared, I see you have a question.
Thanks, TJ. One thing, and I'm just thinking this now as I think more carefully about this, it totally makes sense to me that it's not necessary for the council to make a recommendation around something the Public Service Department is already doing, because it's not a new activity or a new action. But I do want to just pause to recognize that the work of the council, not just, I mean, I think there's a lot of focus, rightly so, on this first climate action plan, the initial plan due December 1st. But I am thinking in the context, and I'd remind folks that, this council was set up to exist and do work in perpetuity. Folks were nominated to multiple year terms. We are going to have the opportunity not just to put forward a climate action plan, an initial plan by December 1st, but also to update and revise that plan, and then put forward additional plans. There's a minimum schedule set, but there's nothing to say that if we get new information and analysis that we couldn't do a second climate action plan in 2022 or 23 rather than 24, which is, I believe, what it says in statute for the second one. And so in reflecting on all of that, it's clear to me that the cost of carbon model and the suggested updates and expansions to it will be really necessary, or that type of information in terms of being able to generate mitigation supply curves in terms of our options for cost effectively reducing greenhouse gas emissions will be really central and foundational, necessary to our work. And so I don't have any different language suggestions that are already there. I just want to recognize that we're in this odd space where there may not need to be a recommendation for new action to happen, but the council will be reliant on that type of report and or the information that's contained in it perhaps existing in a different form going forward. And so
Yeah, I
it
think,
might lead to a question, TJ, which is, and I know that this is perhaps a little unfair and premature because you're just seeing this report, but what do you see as kind of the timeline going forward and the options for incorporating some of these recommendations in the EFG report around updates to the cost of carbon reduction model, and how that may be done in the future, and if there's any resource implications of that, because some of those recommendations were not just simple, quick, easy things, assessing new measures in terms of the portfolio of mitigation strategies and other pieces. So
yeah, I do think are big resource implications. Some of the measures that were recommended to add are easy, could be done with existing staff. Others and other recommendations would be really challenging. And I think, so the way I look at this, and David put up that flow chart of kind of the cost of carbon model and the LEAP model, as kind of an input, right, into more work. And so I do think that the meat of the cost of carbon model is valuable. I also think the LEAP model starts to look at, hey, here's the potential, here's what we're seeing going forward, and the cost of carbon is really an input to that. And so the department, we've got a license to LEAP. Once the model is up and running, we're going to have full training on it, and we're planning to carry that forward into the future. Agency of Natural Resources is as well, and that can be an ongoing tool, which the cost of I guess I'm not sure that there's going to be a cost of carbon report or portion of the annual energy report called out in that way, as opposed to it being kind of a piece of this broader effort of mitigation pathways and tracking what was recommended in the climate action plan and the energy plan and how we're doing relative to our requirements. And so I think it's more embedded in what we already have to do. And I think that's what you're seeing, some of that reflected in this document here of not wanting to be tied into a cost of carbon model, because it is just kind of this foundational piece of, if you're going to do the LEAP modeling and if you're going to track your progress going forward, you kind of have to do this work anyway. And then when you're looking forward in terms of the next climate action plan, that's when more resources are often brought to bear, right? And so we can update the mitigation supply curve on a regular basis as part of that effort, to the extent it's not kind of done annually. So I think there's some uncertainty there, and I think it's fair for people to push back on that and say, no, we want to make sure that this happens. I just am cautious about resources. I'm cautious about kind of tying us to one specific spreadsheet model that the department has done, when there could be better ways to do it. Hopefully that it was responsive to your question. I kind of rambled.
I definitely agree with that latter point about wanting to preserve some flexibility. It's not the exact model or format that it shows up in, it's that the information and analysis exists and is useful to inform strategies and plans. I guess, but I do also think, and it might be worth a conversation with Jane when she is back, as the person who has, I think, the clearest view of the overall remaining budget related for, consulting or analysis support of the council and its in the development of the climate action plan. If there are pieces of these recommendations in terms of improving the cost of carbon model and or getting that information ready to be inputted into LEAP and other forthcoming analysis, does it make sense to, is that adequately captured in the existing contracts, or if there's work there that would go beyond the capacity of existing PSD staff, is it worth questioning whether some of the remaining funds in the council budget should be applied to being able to do this? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's probably a conversation we should tee up with, at least with Jane at some point.
Yeah, I think that same topic is going to come up in the second half of our discussion as well.
Yeah.
Are there other comments on either half of this recommendation, social cost of carbon or the cost of carbon report? And not seeing any hands. I do see some chat messages, so I'm not sure if they're related to this or not.
There's some questions. Brian posted something that I think is the New York report, and I may have misstated. The New York report does have individual estimates for nitrous oxide and methane, as well as for carbon. And so I'm not certain, but it may be safe to assume that that is not CO2e. They provide some text that cautions against use of global warming potentials because of the different damage-based models to equating on a CO2e basis the social cost of CO2e. And so their recommendation is that the best available data, or use the best estimates that are available on a gas specific basis. That is potentially more complicated than using the CO2e based on the global warming potential method. There was a follow-up question then about which time period they're using for the methane. And I think what they have done, I do not think they provide tables that talk about the different GWPs for methane, but I don't think that their table, potentially counter to what I was saying, is that their table, the table that I presented, is based on CO2, not on CO2e. And so I don't think that they have used a global warming potential to include the methane impacts on that. They're recommending methane be separate, and the value for the methane, I don't know what the time horizon or the method that they're using, but they do provide some methane and nitrous oxide values. So a bit more detail and complexity, in case everybody was getting, it was too simple.
It was getting too simple for everybody.
It was getting too simple. So
yeah. Thanks.
David, based on, can I just ask a clarifying question? Based on that, do you feel like the final report that would come in would clarify that? Are you comfortable with the New York recommendation that it's a cost for each gas rather than for CO2e, or would you present it differently in the report that we receive and forward to the council?
I'm not certain, to be honest. I think that the CO2e, I'm seeing, as based apart on Brian's comment, I'm seeing, reviewing again, that they have a caution against, they say it's not necessarily appropriate to use a CO2e across gases, and that there is not a method that's been adopted that uses across gases for the social cost of CO2e, as it were. So that leaves you then potentially adopting the ones that are available are for nitrous oxide and methane, and you could have separate tables for those. So I'm not, it cautions against it, but I haven't seen enough discussion necessarily to make a determination on
Yeah, thank you, David. It's Brian, and I'm not taking a stand one way or another. I'm just looking at that material, in the last 10 minutes,
Yeah, no,
just
I
to
appreciate it.
figure it out, and
Yeah.
and knowing that we'd get comment from someone who would actually go back and look at it. So I think you're characterizing everything quite accurately in the 10 minutes and 30 seconds I had to look at it. It's not clear to me from the New York State paper how they're calculating the methane and nitrous numbers, but I'll continue to look at that as well.
And George just put something in the chat. Yes, at the federal level, they are doing separate for CH4 and N2O. Those aren't, and again, it's not discussed directly in the technical support document that I've reviewed, whether they recommend for or against using a CO2e if you're not going to estimate each one of the gases individually. So apologies for leaving potentially another question on the table, but
it seems to me a fair way forward would be to say we recognize that what we're concerned with is reducing greenhouse gas emissions across the board, and therefore to make this type of analysis as applicable to that purpose as possible, we're going to need one way to estimate the social cost of all greenhouse gases, and one way or the other, and maybe we continue to monitor federal and other reporting about whether the best way to do that is for each gas or via an equivalent.
So it strikes me that this footnote is not necessarily correct. I don't know if you can see the pop-up of the footnote, but emissions other than carbon can and should be converted to carbon equivalent emissions to appropriately value the cost greenhouse gas emissions. From this discussion, I'm not sure we can say that based on the information we've gotten, and we may need to revise that in this document.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah.
But I don't want to leave it behind completely.
Maybe it can just stay the same, TJ, with just language or estimates for individual gases developed, the social cost of individual greenhouse gases.
Yes, as available, the best estimates of the social cost of other individual gases. Then I would welcome if others have seen. I'll suggest some language, and if others have seen further explicit discussions on this, it basically says there are cautions against it and where appropriate, things like that. So, but I think estimates of the social cost of the other gases based on the best available research.
So I want to do a quick time check here. I apologize. I'm struggling to facilitate timeliness here and participate substantively. That it's already after 3 and we have a whole another substantive topic to get to, and we're.
I am seeing, TJ, that Julie, Secretary Moore, is not yet with us. So I mean, if we can try to come to resolution or test for consensus on support for this recommendation document, might be worth pausing to do that, since we've been focused on it.
Yeah, I agree. I want to, I don't have the language tight here for this footnote though. So I want to change that, and then we need to get public comment on this before we.
Maybe TJ, if you want to stop sharing your screen and work on revising that footnote, and we can go to public comment and then see if we have an updated one to consider for adoption by our consensus from the subcommittee after that. But yes, very important to hear. There's been a lot of material covered, so I want to pause to hear comment from any members of the public who may wish to do so. Is there anyone, please, George, I see your hand. Please go ahead.
Hi. Just want to follow up to our chat related interactions. From what I can discern, and it's just an opinion, I'm not going to say I'm going to bring a lot of expertise to this. The National Academy of Sciences is developing 3 independent societal costs for methane and nitrous oxide in parallel to carbon dioxide. And to the extent that that's going on, and in fact, you may need to align with it in the future, you probably should anticipate that and adopt policies that have a trio of societal costs. And it appears the table that Ryan pointed to over in New York is a reasonable starting point for that. It doesn't seem like you want to develop your own societal cost factors if you can get on the piggybacks of someone else's. That's my comment.
Thank you, George. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak to the report on the social cost of carbon or the cost of carbon reduction model material that's been covered? And George, just to note, your hand is still up. Unless you have you realize that there's something else you wanted to add.
Jared, this is Dave Westman.
Yeah, Dave, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks for this great presentation, and TJ and Dave, I really want to compliment all the hard work that it takes to put all of this material together. I do just want to comment on this CO2 equivalent discussion, mostly because, as some may know, Efficiency Vermont, who I would be representing on this call here today, is actively engaged in programs designed to improve the efficiency and reduced emissions from refrigerant containing equipment. So that would be HFCs, fluorinated gases, which have a very high CO2 equivalent. And so I recognize this conversation as being sort of specific to whether or not CH4 and N2O may have their own societal cost of carbon, but to the extent that other gases may need to be accounted for in the state inventory, putting all of those gases under one accounting method would be very helpful for tracking and goals purposes. And, you know, if you start splitting up all of the gases to have like different values and different goals associated with it, because CH4 is 21 times or 100 times, depending on the life cycle of the model that you're using from, it just gets really complicated really quickly. And I guess my point would be is that if you're trying to communicate this and have this be a functional plan that is intended to drive state action, encourage state programs, and, you know, give a real tangible goal to achieve, you ought to have like a simple way of boiling all of those messages down. And I totally appreciate what George is saying about having specificity, but I don't think we should lose fact that there's also a communication piece to this too, where, you know, I think that the technocrats like us who are in this committee and enjoy these conversations, it may be lost on others. And so I think that there needs to be an easy way to sort of say what the goals would be.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. And I think directionally, I mean, it's some of the other gas. I mean, I don't know whether the interagency working group will develop even for the other gases. Those haven't been developed yet because there's enough, you know, lagging research and trying to figure out carbon, which is, you know, still the major greenhouse gas at the federal level. And so equating everything into the CO2e, that's been part of the rationale for doing that. And I think that it does, you know, do these changes sometimes make material differences on the types of activities that we as the state or the state wants to promote to reduce emissions across all gases? And you know, sometimes the complexity may not lead to substantive changes on the way things are being addressed, but You know, the fluorinated gases is a good example. If you don't count the fluorinated gases, then you might not be doing a refrigeration replacement or refrigerator or leak reduction replacement initiative, which is important. So, but thank you. Your points are well taken.
So, oh, go ahead, Jared.
Oh, I was just going to check to see if there were any other comments from folks who have not yet had the chance. Would like to. Okay. If not, I wonder, we still, oh, I see George's hand is up again. Please go ahead, George.
So it's an interesting point about refrigerants. As I understand them, they're generally very long-lived. And as I understand the algorithms used in the integrated assessment models that do the societal cost calculation, they do so over long lifespans, multiple decades, which obviously would allow for refrigerants to be equivalent to carbon dioxide to the extent that you consider them both long-lived global warming gases. In contrast, methane obviously has a shorter lifespan, although while it's in the atmosphere, it's much more. There's much more of it because we emit so much of it, and its lifespan, of course, is on the scale of decades with a half-life of 12 years. So, you know, I can see the merit of doing the refrigerants as somehow integrated as the carbon dioxide equivalent. I'm a little less convinced that nitrous oxide and methane are necessarily behaving the same in the models when they calculate societal cost. So there's probably some technical merit interior to those models that would treat those gases differently. I think that's a long way of saying I don't know enough about the interior of the algorithms used in DICE and other IAMs, but it seems likely that over the timescale they're working in, you could use a refrigerant carbon dioxide equivalent for your purposes and not be actually that far inaccurate in what outcomes you are getting.
Thank you, George.
So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. And this is the edit to the footnote that I made to try and be responsive. I can make it bigger if it's helpful. That emissions other than carbon should also be considered, and societal cost of those emissions should be appropriately quantified to value the cost of emitting or the benefit associated with mitigation of those emissions. As I read that, I used emissions 3 times in that sentence, but substantively, does that get to the point? And
I think so. The only small suggestion I would make, and maybe this is overly detailed and pedantic, but would be to say greenhouse gas emissions, just to make sure that nobody thinks we're talking about non-greenhouse gas emissions, like, yeah. But otherwise, I think that,
I mean, you could almost just end the sentence after quantified. But.
Also, y'all are falling into the trap of using the word carbon to mean carbon dioxide.
yeah.
Yep. Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, I agree. You can stop after quantified.
Okay. So with that change, I kind of want to, I know we're running way long here, but we're almost here on this task. So do folks agree with forwarding the report in this memo to the full council? So I get a thumbs up from Jared. I'm going to actually stop sharing. Thumbs up from Leslie Ann. Richard, Jay, Lou. That is all of the members here. Great. Well, I think that is that's successful. We'll forward that along. And just by the way, there is a full council meeting on Monday. I unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, will not be there, but Jared will be presenting this to the full council on Monday, and wherever we land after our next discussion. And so I encourage other subcommittee members, particularly those who have been engaged on the issues, to join that full council meeting as well.
Yes, that would be great as folks are able. At this point, I still don't see Julie, but I think it's safe to move forward. Well, first, it's probably worth pausing just to, again, I mean, we're just working at such rapid speed, but even amidst that, I think it is important to pause and express thanks and celebrate progress. This is a big step forward in terms of the information and analysis available to us. It will, getting clarity on these points is going to be really helpful to the analysis we need to provide for the climate action plan. So just really want to thank David and Liz and the whole team at EFG and Cadmus, who've been working on this and done really high quality work, voluminous research, and coming up with good, substantive and clear recommendations for us to consider and act on and move forward, and to all the attention and thoughtfulness for the folks who've been reviewing documents. So this is exciting. I know it can feel tedious at times, but this is significant, and thank you to everybody who's been involved.
Thank you, Jared. We would thank everybody on the committee for participating and providing inputs and review, and very thoughtful and thoughtful discussion on all these points.
Great. So with that, I think it is probably, even though we do not yet have Secretary Moore with us, I think it would be good. I'm happy to go ahead and share my screen and present the draft for discussion regarding the greenhouse gas recommendations. And let me go ahead and do that. Oops. Okay, can folks see my screen? Okay,
yep, we can see it.
So very similar to the format of the document that TJ shared, this would be to say that our subcommittee has reviewed the paper titled Greenhouse Gas Inventory Review, Vermont's Current Methods in a Comparison with Accepted Practices and Recommendations, that we recommend adoption of that report, and that we're pleased to forward it to the full committee for their review. This section basically restates the recommendations and decision points that were presented by David via PowerPoint last week, and that folks have already seen. So there is not really new information here. That the draft recommendation is to continue to maintain and update the current sector-based or in-boundary greenhouse gas emissions inventory that the Agency of Natural Resources produces, for consistency with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Environmental Protection Agency, and peer states. Recommend that we continue to report on gross emissions, meaning the sources of our greenhouse gas emissions, because those are the emissions that are referenced in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions reduction requirements in the Global Warming Solutions Act, at least for 2025 and 2030, while also working to improve how we track and report on net emissions. And this is here net is not just the sources of emissions, but also the sinks. And we note that we are not ready to make recommendations about the carbon budget or about net emissions tracking, specifically around better estimation of carbon sinks, because that is part of the task 2 carbon budget effort that EFG is still working on with members of that task group. So those recommendations would come at a later date. We identified that for the existing sector-based and in-boundary inventory that Vermont produces, we want to see supplemental information and sensitivity analysis as part of the next published inventory, including but not limited to these specific pieces on biogenic greenhouse gases. Again, that will likely relate back to the carbon budget report and recommendations, but also presentation of alternate time horizons for global warming potential of greenhouse gases. Previously we had talked about this as some folks wanting to see a GWP 20 value for methane. I do think we thought it was problematic to just pick out, one gas to treat it differently than another. So it's safer and more consistent to present all greenhouse gases in both a GWP 20 and GWP 100 framework, so folks can see how the tallies would be different depending on which you used. But I think there is an assumption that we would continue to follow EPA guidance and pure state practice of GWP 100 as the default value presented in the inventory, but recognizing that it can be valuable to look at the implications of a different choice. A recognition that the current inventory uses the IPCC AR4 values, but over time those values get updated, and it will be helpful to see how those updates, what implications they have, those new values have for our inventory, and that we should be using the latest values when possible. There are 2 pieces on maintaining REC accounting. This was in terms of the basis for calculating our electricity sector emissions. I would note that this is different than the question of calculating upstream or life cycle emissions, which is treated later in this paper. And then again, finally, I should pause there and say that it was very helpful that EFG identified the resource that exists in terms of REC settlement information developed by the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Conservation, which we know ANR is already looking into using for characterization of REC values in the region. And then finally, also concurring with the EFG recommendation about adopting key category analysis for future inventories. So that would be the overall set of recommendations with regard to the current inventory. Additionally, we wanted to make a set of recommendations around specifying the desire for and the plan to achieve supplemental information to act as a decision-making aid, especially when we look at mitigation pathways and strategies. And that would be around and the terms here, we recognize that the terms really matter and the importance of having definitional clarity, because upstream emissions accounting is or can be different than life cycle emissions accounting. And we do not yet have a full sense of the resources available or the organizations that exist that could put together such an accounting for us. So the recommendation here would be to first develop and issue a request for information regarding conducting an upstream or life cycle accounting of Vermont's emissions related to the use of energy in Vermont. And then likely develop and issue a request for proposals to select a technical expert who could do the first iteration of designing and conducting that accounting, but produce that ideally in such a way that it can be updated year after year by the Agency of Natural Resources alongside it, in addition to the in-boundary inventory. I think the recognition here is that regardless of where you come down on the interpretation of how to read the Global Warming Solutions Act statute in terms of what it requests or requires for emissions tracking and reporting, and I think that there is likely inconsistency or fairly conflicting viewpoints about what that direction is. Because there is disagreement, and because we know that there is value to having different ways of looking at our emissions, not just those that occur in Vermont, but also those that we can fairly be understood to be responsible for when we consume energy here that has either upstream or life cycle emissions that occur outside of our boundaries. The recommendation here is that we would move forward and develop an upstream or life cycle energy use emissions accounting for Vermont. This would require, we recognize, additional resources. Certainly if we go an RFI and RFP route to develop such an accounting from the budget available to the council, and then to the extent that there would be additional work required for conducting not just the in-boundary inventory, but an ongoing update to that upstream or life cycle accounting in future years, that would be additional work that we would need to figure out how to resource, or that ANR and the state would need to figure out how to resource in collaboration with the council. And then it just ends with noting that given how late we are in the process of, how near we are to the December 1st deadline for an initial plan, climate action plan, that the results of that RFI and RFP process may not be complete by that date. And so recognizing that we should take the information that is presently available to us to look at questions of upstream or life cycle analysis related to our energy use and the fuels that we are already aware we are consuming as tracked in the inventory, recognize that kind of lens of analysis should also be put on, to the extent possible, the mitigation pathways, strategies, and actions that get recommended by the Cross-Sector Mitigation Committee and by the council. I do think that overall, the vast majority of those pathways, strategies, and actions are likely going to, if well designed, show an impact regardless of what lens we use, regardless of whether it's in boundary or regardless of whether it is upstream or life cycle. When we are reducing fossil fuel use, gasoline, diesel in the transportation sector, fuel oil, propane, and natural gas in the thermal sector, for instance, those are going to show up no matter how we account for these. There are relatively marginal differences between these two different approaches, but there can be important differences that we nevertheless need to be aware of. The most obvious of which that comes to mind is how natural gas emissions would show up in an in-boundary inventory versus an upstream or life cycle accounting of those gases. But there are other energy sources that would show up differently through those different lenses, and we need to, in terms of responsible recommendations and policy making, need to use both of those lenses of analysis to make sure that we don't have unintended consequences. So that is the overall gist of the set of recommendations that our task group, very huge thanks to Richard Hopkins and Colin Smythe, who we have worked quite a bit together over the last week to come up with these recommendations. Feel like they are very much consistent and in alignment with the EFG report, but then also hopefully give some additional helpful specificity around next steps to make sure that if we recognize that type of accounting could be valuable, how are we actually going to do it? And what are the next steps to do so? So I recognize that I have been speaking for quite a while. I am going to stop doing that and see if there are any questions about this proposal from the GHG task group. And I'm hoping that Secretary Moore may be with us now. Oh, and I see she is. Okay, Secretary Moore, please go ahead.
Yes, so thank you, Jared. I appreciate the committee's willingness to defer this particular piece of the agenda until I was able to join you, and appreciate your thorough walkthrough. I don't have any real questions about the specific sort of recommendations on page 1 of the memo. And so if folks do, maybe let them go first, but I am interested in discussing sort of the next steps and the resources that are or aren't available to support them. And so I'm happy to pause there and see if there are folks who would like to talk about items 1 through 5 on page 1 before diving into the RFI and RFP component.
Okay. Great. Is there anyone who wants to ask a question or make a comment on from the committee on items 1 through 5, and then we'll open this up to public comment after. TJ.
Yeah, thanks. And my comment is not on the particular points, but again, about the framing of the memo. And this occurred to me in between when you sent your memo, the memo out, Jared, and when I sent the second memo out, but that the memo is to the Vermont Climate Council. And I think some of the intro, or just where it says the state of Vermont should, I think the phrasing should be directed to the Vermont Climate Council, at least together with like the Vermont Climate Council and the state of Vermont, or to give the Climate Council then the opportunity to make their recommendation going forward. So
Something like
that. It's a small one, but I think it's important for the Climate Council to receive it that way. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, TJ. Anyone else comments on or questions on this first page? Okay, Secretary Moore, I think it's fair to go to your comments on the second half of this.
Great. Thank you. I support the idea of going out with a request for information. I think there are a number of important questions that need to be asked about life cycle accounting of emissions, and just know, based on the experience we had in developing ultimately the RFP for the technical contractor, that RFI experience served us extremely well. I'm a little afraid of getting ahead of ourselves in saying that we're committed to issuing an RFP absent having benefit of the responses to the RFI and further committing budget. As I think folks are aware, there's currently about $350,000 remaining in the allocation that the agency received on behalf of the Climate Council to support sort of overall contractor services. We've talked about a number of different needs in this space, everything from work related to the Municipal Vulnerability Index, work related to just transitions and equity, and providing support around applying the rubric to pathway strategies and actions as they continue to be developed. Some expanded technical services to look at 2030 strategies, as well as things needed to get us to 2025, as well as the ability to go back and refine based on public feedback post December 1st on things related to the existing strategies and actions. And I worry that this takes it maybe a step further than we should be prepared to go at this particular point in time. My personal feeling is that recommending the RFI and then a reevaluation based on the responses to the RFI about next steps is a reasonable commitment. But I guess I would stop short of going all the way to actually implementing the recommendations that come back as a result of the RFI to go ahead and adopt an upstream or life cycle accounting of greenhouse gas emissions. I think they're going to be multiple and significant demands placed on the Agency of Natural Resources, as well as the other agencies of state government. And I think we need to be in a position to sort of consider that full breadth and weight of what may be asked in determining the relative priority placed on this particular action.
Thank you, Julie. Is there anyone else who has comments on this page, or wants to or has thoughts on what Secretary Moore just shared? David, you're on mute. if you were, maybe you're intending to be. It looked like you wanted to. So my apologies. Okay, so I think at this point, unless you have a different suggestion, TJ, I think let's open this up for public comment on this set of draft recommendations and then come around to discussing next steps as a subcommittee. George, I see your hand is up, and then if there's anyone else, please feel free to use that reactions button to hit raise hand so we know you'd like to speak next in the queue.
Good afternoon. First off, I'd like to thank the subcommittee for their recommendations draft. I encourage the full committee, Science Data Committee, to adopt it as written, subject, of course, to the minor edits that TJ has already applied. With respect to Ms. Moore's statements, certainly there's, as on a previous occasion when we spoke and interacted perhaps 2 months back, it was clearly identified back then and still remains true today that if there's a shortage of resource for a particular type of activity that the Climate Council deems has value, it's up to them to step over to the legislature and as part of their package, do the ask for those resources. In the short term, obviously, the RFI process will obviously gather the information that will instruct how one would develop the RFP. And that would allow you to quantify, certainly before the end of this year, what the major components would be in the RFP, what the scale of the costs could be. You might even get your bids back from the RFP by then, and go to the legislature in the next season with a budget proposal that's fairly well quantified. As compared to right now, we've not obviously acquired that information needed to make a budget. So I recommend that the Science Data Committee move forward with an RFP process. And a major benefit of this, frankly, is that it'll put you on track to be fully compliant with the intent of the legislature at the Global Warming Solutions Act, which, although we haven't spoken much about it, most of our work's been talking about the technical aspects. That legal aspect still remains very prominent. And this would go a long way towards, I think, accommodating one of the major cornerstones that was embodied in that act. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Are there any other public, or TJ, was there a direct response that you wanted to?
Yeah, thanks, Jared. I just wanted to ask so it sounded like, George, your comment said adopt the document as written, but it also said that we should ask the legislature for the money. And I wonder if that is the difference here, and that recommendation, that next step number 2 is based on the response to the RFI request. The Vermont Climate Council should request the funding and appropriation for the as opposed to just going in to do an RFP, which may or may not be resourced. And so it's really then, if the Climate Council ultimately decides that this is a good thing to do, then the legislature needs to kind of get behind it and fund it.
Obviously, I'm not fully familiar with the Climate Council's budget. I gather from Ms. Moore's comments that there are many competing asks on how to allocate that money. And given that, probably an RFI and all the effort administratively to develop and operate that would be within the means of that budget if you're careful of how you spend it. Obviously, if the RFP process was done this year, the good news about doing so would be that you have a fairly concrete number based on proposals responding to go to the legislature for that resource that is currently believed to be missing. Honestly, you know, the legislature probably should be thought about more actively than has been the case so far. If I'm not mistaken, there are certain hooks in the legislature, in GWSA, that kind of place the Climate Council in the role of sending advice to the legislature and also to the Public Utilities Commission about your activities and climate action plan. All that stuff, I think, ultimately has to be folded into a budgetary request to the extent that you need funding. Like we said, you know, I think it's kind of self-evident. If you're going to have a climate action plan, you're also going to have to do some funding for it, or it won't happen. And what the scale of that is and how you spend that money, what's your proposal for that? That's all part of the package I would expect that's developed in parallel to the climate actions plans, technical and organizational related statements. So it's just a matter of recognizing there's an additional work item that's not talked about here so far. It was always present, we just never identified it.
Thank you,
Right.
George.
Yeah, thank you.
Steve Crowley, please go ahead.
Hi, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. At first, huge appreciation for the work you've all done on all of this, David, and your work, as well as the work on this particular memo. A couple of things. I think the memo is great. I want to mention a couple of things that seem to be maybe in the margins of the memo or aren't quite stated. One about RECs and one about accountability. Regarding RECs, I guess probably to me there are two important things about RECs. One is the question of whether they actually change the carbon budget overall. Whether if you put a bubble around our region and you have some system happening within that, if it doesn't change the overall carbon budget, then it's not working. And I think that's been pointed out in some of the testimony that in comments that you know, there are certainly times when certain sets of RECs do not change the amount of carbon emission that's happening. It just sort of changes something on paper, but doesn't really make a difference. And if that's true, then the system isn't working, whatever the history of the system is. The second point on RECs is that RECs themselves are pretty much of a binary question, right? They're either a REC or it's not a REC, or it's a renewable energy credit. It gets, you know, it essentially in the system that we have, either it's yes, it is, or no, it isn't. And greenhouse gases aren't like that. There's hardly a renewable energy. There aren't any energy sources that are really carbon neutral or zero. And certainly if we're talking about things like biomass and hydro, they're significant greenhouse gas impact. So just to call that a REC, or just to call a REC a 0 point in your accounting is to me that's flawed, and I hope that gets worked in to the system as it goes forward. So that's what I have to say about RECs. The question of accountability is a big one for the choice of which inventory plan we use. Is it the you know, the Global Warming Solutions Act develops a system of accountability for achieving goals, and one of these, I don't know if you can use two different accounting systems and call them both, you know, bottom line for accountability. I think that comes, I'm not sure how that works in the long run. So I would argue that the law calls for those, you know, the upstream energy inventory, that more complete inventory to be the accountability basis. And I don't know if we're ready for that yet. It's going to take some work to pull that together. It's good to see that moving forward, but ultimately, I think somebody is going to need to figure out what's the basis for accountability, whether we've met those goals or not. And I don't know if it's going to come from the Climate Council or from rulemaking or from the legislature or from the courts. I don't know, but sooner or later, somebody's going to have to figure that out. And I think it has a big bearing. It has a big bearing on choices that are made. Jared, you mentioned natural gas as something that is affected a lot, and how we measure, for example, how we measure renewable natural gas. Is that going to be a 0 point, or is that going to be something that has its own complex set of emissions? And importantly, this has to do with in the electric sector, which makes great claims of being close to 0 emissions. Well, that's only if you use the current inventory and 0 counting for hydro and 0 counting for biomass and 0 counting for fugitive methane emissions. But if you count all those things, then that creates a big demand to figure out how you're going to get to 0. So if we're not really at 0, we have to figure out how to get there. And so that puts, to me, I know there are a lot of possible answers to that, but to me that calls for a lot of deployment of solar energy around Vermont, and a lot more than is demanded by the status quo inventory. So the sooner that, I guess my point is, the sooner that gets figured out, the better, because that process, that strategy of deploying renewables around Vermont, really, you know, real zero greenhouse gas renewables should start sooner rather than later. So that's all I have. I do appreciate the memo. I think the memo is great. I think it's really moving in the right direction. And I think that there are a couple of questions in the margin there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. I'll just offer a quick response, which is, you know, I do think that to a lay reader like me, at least, and to others who are looking at this, it can be confusing to try to follow exactly what the Global Warming Solutions Act is requiring or asking for in terms of emissions accounting, especially when it refers to prior statute, in terms of how we conduct our inventory. My feeling on that has been, since I am not a legal expert, and I don't think that question will be settled before we have a climate action plan, that, and because we know that additional information comparing an upstream or a life cycle accounting to an inboundary or sector accounting is valuable to us as we assess strategies and mitigation pathways, that I have felt as though, even if I don't want to take a question on what exactly the law is saying or not saying, at the very least, we can move forward and have both, be able to have both lenses of analysis going forward, and that is valuable. But that's just my perspective on it. I do see that Megan O'Toole from the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation has raised her hand. Megan, speaking of legal expertise, Megan, I would invite you to comment on this.
Sure, thanks, Jared. And we've talked about this before in this committee, but I just wanted to reiterate that, you know, as Jared mentioned, there's pieces of the Global Warming Solutions Act that, you know, weren't just drafted, you know, this past year. They've been, part of our laws related to greenhouse gas emission reductions for many years, if not decades. And the language related to reducing emissions outside the boundaries of the state, that piece of language that's in section 10 VSA section 578, that that's been on the book since 2005. And I think that unfortunately, as I've mentioned before, when the GWSA was drafted, there was, I think, some inadvertent conflicts in the language that was included in the whole package that did end up in the piece of legislation that was ultimately passed, because section 578 then in turn points to measuring our emissions in the methodology prescribed in section 582, and section 582 does not contemplate counting those types of emissions by virtue of the fact that it points to counting emissions based on consistency with other jurisdictions and other methodologies that do not count those types of emissions. And so we do have that conflict. And then I just also want to point out again, as I've mentioned before, section 582G, which is the piece that directs the Agency of Natural Resources to develop a methodology for accounting for life cycle emissions. That piece was added to section 582 subsequent to that inventory first being called for by the legislature and ANR being directed to do so. And it's arguable that it really was the intent there was that for that to be a standalone tool, and for it not to be used to actually inventory our emissions, but just as a methodology to account for those emissions as a standalone tool. So I just wanted to kind of reiterate those comments. I know you all have heard me say that before, but just wanted to bring that back to this conversation.
Thank you, Megan. If it's okay, Secretary Moore, I believe you're still with us. I have a question for you in the interest of trying to see if we can arrive at consensus on these recommendations from the subcommittee to go to the full council. And I just have a clarifying question. Is your concern, and this may not be an either or question, it might be a both. Is your concern about having that second piece identifying an RFP process, is that because you think that an RFP may not be necessary depending on the responses to the RFI, or for instance, if we're able to do a contract amendment with an existing contract versus issuing a whole new RFP, or is it or is it a concern that we may not be able to do that contract work, whether it's an RFP with a newly engaged contractor, or whether it's through an existing contract, due to money limit or resource limitations in terms of the remaining ANR/council budget?
Yes, more the latter, although there's a bit of the former too. I'm not sure, at least personally, I fully understand the extent of what would be asked there. Part of what I am certainly reacting to is what would be required of ANR staff. I think that we have significant concerns about sort of our existing capacity and mandates and our ability to take on new work, and concerned if we don't sort of have a fully thought through proposal that we're advancing to the legislature, we could go through an RFP process, end up with a whiz-bang set of methods, and have no resources at the agency to actually operationalize it. And I think we have to be very clear about what the entirety that we're asking for, and solicit that kind of commitment from the legislature prior to having a recommendation to move forward and begin that work. That said, I agree very much with George's comments. I think there's enormous value in moving forward with the request for information and doing it sooner than not, and getting that kind of input and feedback that could round out and inform the conversation that I think really has to happen with the legislature before the council sort of commits to those as next steps.
Yeah, I guess my assumption had been that given the remaining available funds, and given the kind of foundational importance of knowing the answer to some of these questions and having that type of accounting, that it should be a priority. But of course, I think that, and I'm sure that every other subcommittee chair and co-chair thinks that about work that they want to see happening next. And I can totally appreciate that, depending on the timeline, the remaining funds available and the responses to the RFI, the next step may not be, using already allocated funds. It might be a new request.
Well, and in part because I do believe strongly that there is an ongoing commitment from the agency that will be necessary to implement this sort of change in accounting methods, and need to be sure up front before we develop that method and somehow hitch our horse to that cart, that there is a clear commitment to provide the resources and capacity at the agency to be able to support its implementation.
I guess I agree with all of that, and I'm comfortable kind of not necessarily specifying an RFP in this set of recommendations, but I do feel confident that one way or another, we will need to end up as a council and as a state having a supplemental either upstream or life cycle analysis to inform our strategies. And I just want to make sure that if we know that's where we want to end up, that recommendation gets captured, even if the mechanism to get there specifically around an RFP, we don't want to limit ourselves or be overly specific at this point in time.
I guess maybe my question is more about when than if, and just the priority for this work now. Whether we have enough information about the direction and the magnitude that we need to go in the near term, that this is where we want to invest. It's not to say that I guess I agree with you, Jared, that ultimately I think this is a tool we will likely have need of. And maybe that's a question for the RFI too, is when does this become sort of a fundamental driver in our decision making? And some of that is all going to be tied up in how we prioritize as a council the overall recommendations that come in from each of the subcommittees related to strategies and actions. So there's an inordinate number of moving pieces right now. And I honor that complexity and that understand that the reasonable people could disagree in this space about the timing and when to move forward. I think it's easy, as I said, to reach agreement on issuing an RFI and starting to solicit that additional input and information, and would be very comfortable with a recommendation to that effect.
Well, so that other members of the subcommittee aren't just listening to Secretary back and forth, I want to pause in questions in terms of this topic and our way forward. Richard.
I just wonder if you could keep the current language and introduce that second paragraph with some words that say, depending on the results of the RFI, issue an RFP, but leave that rest of that RFP language alone.
Or identify a plan and timeline for an alternate strategy to result in the same product.
Yeah, and then maybe it would be a set of modifications to the second paragraph under item 2, where we talk about funds from the budget available for the council, and just recognize that there's a cost both in doing this work and associated with the capacity needed within an ANR to support the ongoing maintenance of this work, as opposed to tying the budget for the RFP to the funds that exist currently, and then some longer term need that, and have that larger discussion as a recommendation coming from the council to the legislature if the council indeed supports it.
Okay. I appreciate both those recommendations, Richard and Julie. I feel like if I was a faster and better writer, I could try to adapt the draft on the fly, but recognizing that it is 3:59 and we have a scheduled stop time of 4 o'clock. I wonder if, I may be out over my skis on this, but I wonder if the subcommittee would be comfortable I would be happy to basically take this feedback, work on incorporating it along the lines that have just been suggested, and then sharing that. I mean, the challenge is that we are presenting to the council on Monday, and of course, in terms of public meetings, we won't have a chance to meet and arrive at consensus on the exact language again before then. But I wonder if there is general comfort with the first part of the draft and adjusting basically recommendation 2 on the second page along the lines that Secretary Moore and Richard just suggested. I know it's hard to do that without seeing the exact language, but I think given our time frame and process, if we can try to arrive at consensus, and I will at least share an updated draft, even though we can't then discuss or vote on it due to public meeting rules, but I could share an updated draft that tries to incorporate this.
Based on your track record so far, Jared, I think you can do that fine. I trust you.
Yeah, I think we could, if this as a subcommittee, we say, authorize the task group plus Julie to approve the final language that is consistent with as being consistent with these discussions. I think we could do that, and if it's the 3 of you as subcommittee members on the task group does not then make a quorum to require any new public meeting notice.
Okay.
I'm happy for that approach, and I don't think we're that far apart.
Right.
I think we're very close. Thank you for that suggestion, TJ. I think it's good. I don't know whether, I know that we're towards the end of our scheduled agenda, but I can't remember if the original agenda did include a final round of public comment. I don't know if the hands from George or David are new or old, but I'm assuming if they are still up, they are new and I understand if folks need to leave the meeting because of our scheduled stop time, but I for one, and I think others are available to stay a little bit after to make sure we hear your comments. So please go ahead. I think I saw George's hand first.
I'm not sure what to make of this development. Obviously, the devil's in the details. As I understood it, it's basically tweaking the section that revolves around the RFP in a way that tries to split the difference between having it firmly in plan and not having it at all. I'm not exactly sure what admittance criteria one would have for this RFP. In terms of actual effort, I hear Ms. Moore speaking to this as, from her perception, a major effort. I'm assuming if that organization, their organization is not able to do it, but it's important to the function of the climate councils and ability to do sound decision making, then maybe the path forward is to have that activity in the climate council itself as opposed to at A&R. This is a thought. I'm speaking randomly in other words, if you can have the expertise to do the job, that would be a reasonable choice as when to avoid overburdening A&R if it's a burden for them.
Just to
or maybe another state agency like Public Service Department. Obviously, that's kind of first thoughts about if it's a perceived burden, then obviously that's not advisable. We'll have to steer to some places more willing to embrace it.
So just to be clear, A&R is the fiduciary essentially for the Climate Council. The money that the Climate Council has used for contractor services is all run through the agency's budget. And that this would be there was very little staff capacity, new staff capacity provided to support the work of the Climate Council and any of the agencies of state government. And so our ability to take on above and beyond work beyond the direct support of the council is very limited, and just need to be thoughtful about how far out we get with the recommendations absent a commitment from the legislature to fund them.
Fair enough.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Secretary Moore. David, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jared. I know time is short, so I'll try to be quick. Dave Westman from Efficiency Vermont. I just wanted to go back to this idea of the rec recommendation, and I'm just a little bit concerned that the language that is being used to describe how rec accounting is being used is perhaps overly broad, and that in fact, TJ knows this as well as I, how recs are used in accounting for greenhouse gas reduction goals and greenhouse gas reductions has been treated historically in a different way by the Public Utility Commission, where energy efficiency, for example, displaces the more expensive marginal generating unit in the ISO New England system. I understand Megan's legal points perfectly well, that there's a long established history and precedent of the law accounting for purchased electric emissions based on these rec purchases. But I would just be concerned that this language seems overly broad, that all electric sector emissions are accounted for through recs, when in fact there is this existing precedent at the PUC and is actually up for a contested case proceeding in front of the commission this year over how efficiency and greenhouse gas reduction goals should be accounted for.
Thank you, David. I wonder, just quickly, it feels to me that there's a distinction between the way that we account for electricity sector emissions in the in-boundary inventory versus the way that that emissions reduction from electricity sector kind of programs and activities are treated under an efficiency proceeding, or even perhaps eventually in different tiers of the renewable energy standard or other programs that might, for instance, want to assign a value to reductions from marginal generating units rather than the overall kind of rec portfolio on an annual basis. Is that, I wonder if we just add the specificity around, utilizing recs for tracking the electricity sector emissions for purposes of the in-boundary inventory.
Yeah, I think that's right, Jared. The in-boundary inventory referring to, the in-state distribution utility electric purchasing patterns, I think is like the specific amount. And again, I don't want to get into contested case matters, but I mean, this is kind of the nature of the discussion, is that we have a societal boundary condition, which is perhaps, or, subject to discussion over whether that societal distinction is different from this sort of Vermont inbound metric. So I think it would be safe to say that, the electric sector purchases are sort of accounted for on the basis of recs, which, that leaves open the possibility that greenhouse gas reduction goals could be considered on a more societal basis. But again, I'm probably saying too much based on a contested case process. Yeah, TJ's nodding yes, so maybe we shouldn't.
I mean, I don't want to deter you from that. I just think it's going into the weeds of that process when we're a bit over time here. I think it's a very interesting case, and it's not a contested case. It's using those procedures. So, but the Public Utility Commission treats kind of the emissions from programs in multiple different ways depending on the situation, and whether that's appropriate or not is kind of up for debate, and how it relates to the inventory is important. I agree with David on that. but I'm not sure that revisions are necessary to the current document at this
As long as
point.
there's a distinction between the inventory versus like process for setting goals. That's the main point, right? Is that greenhouse gas reduction goals from the electric sector may be treated a little differently than just RECs alone.
Well, I guess I will continue on this path for a second, because the greenhouse gas reduction requirements, they're not goals, we're required to reduce greenhouse gases, are set based on the current inboundary inventory, which, you know, treats RECs in a certain way. And so I think the language is currently accurate, and you know, I'm sure, Dave, we could work out some language that was agreeable to put in here, but I'm not sure that we're going to be able to do it on the call here, and I don't know that it's necessary.
I mean, I think a very straightforward thing would be to say, for purposes of our in-boundary inventory, which is language that's not in there now.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that also.
Thank you, Jared. Appreciate that. Thank you, TJ.
Dr. Dupini-Giroux, I see your hand is up.
Thanks a lot, Jared. I just wanted to offer up the fact that maybe half of the subcommittee has not weighed in as yet, and maybe like me need to sort of like ruminate and just delve a little bit deeper into the actual words that are going to be put forward, and instead of trying to rush it in the time that we have left or the time we're over, to maybe sort of put a pin in it and to see what some of all of these various wordsmiths look like. And then if Megan O'Toole is still on, if she might provide some sort of guidance on how it might look like for us to give that final piece back before we actually take this to the full council on Monday.
I wonder if an option would be, if there are subcommittee members who are comfortable with the direction we're moving in terms of the content that's been presented and the adaptations that have been discussed. If you are not yet there yet, Dr. Dupini-Giroux, in terms of your comfort with that, I wonder if you could just join the task group in our final review of that document. But I also know that I'm not looking enough to see total subcommittee membership and quorum.
I think you're bumping up against a quorum there, Jared.
So I guess I would just, I don't know if others have a suggested way forward. I'm not as expert in public meeting process, and I'm just trying to get us to a point where we can share on Monday the recommendations.
Jared, this is Megan. It unfortunately, you know, there is these requirements are really hard to navigate, you know, when you're trying to you know, finalize pieces of work that the committee has done outside of meetings. So I'm not sure that I can offer a good solution, except to say that, you know, you certainly could warn a special meeting of the committee to very quickly finalize the document, you know, in an open meeting. That would be one option, to just kind of meet briefly outside of your normal time, to move things forward in advance of your next scheduled meeting on which I believe is next Wednesday. So that's an option.
I think it's just that the planned council agenda for Monday covers a lot of these recommendations from the Science Data Subcommittee. So it would be not before Wednesday, it would be before
Friday afternoon.
Which we could try to do. Another option might be to present the recommendations as one coming from the full subcommittee, and in terms of the one that was already agreed to by consensus, and then the GHG related one presented from the task group. And then subcommittee members who are not on the task group reserve the right to comment on. I don't know, I'm sorry.
You still
Yeah.
have, just a thought, I mean, we started slightly late. If you still have a quorum to work through it in the next 15 minutes.
I guess my question for Dr. Dupini-Giroux is there a specific concern that you have, or is it just generally wanting more time to sit with and review the language?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to see it all in one place, all written out, just like we did with the little amendment that TJ did on his memo. And also sort of lifting up the fact that both Jay and Lou have not commented at all. And so giving them the time and space that they may need is to say whatever it is they need to say.
For myself, I'll say that I'm comfortable with the language that's been proposed, with any amendments that need to be made to account for in our staff considerations.
Yeah, I would say that silence is my consent. And I would like to be a little more informed in this, but I don't want things to be held up either. So that's where I stand.
The other thing I would offer is that we're going to be going to much more frequent council meetings effective in September, obviously with the council meeting again on the 14th, I believe. And I'm not sure, we could bring forward, to the extent the folks present reached agreement on the first of the two items earlier in the meeting, bring that one forward and just ask that the second one be put off until the 14th. I think what we had envisioned for the major agenda item, and Marion can correct me if I'm wrong, on the 14th, we don't believe is going to be ready, just because of the mitigation strategies needing more time to be fully developed. And so there's probably space on the agenda, and I'm not sure that there's a reason to rush this across the finish line, and just want to appreciate that it is hard when you receive it, recognizing we're all moving a million miles an hour, but to receive a document at the morning of a meeting to try to revise it and get to final is a lot of process to go through in a short period of time.
I would defer to Megan or others who know more about this than I do. Would an option be that the task group makes those revisions, comes up with a revised document, sends it to the full committee, and if there are concerns, it sounds like it's at this point there is mostly comfort, but Dr. Dubini-Giroux wants the opportunity to review. If there would be concerns, say, I'm not comfortable, and if there are not, and we don't hear anything, present it on Monday. Would that be consistent or appropriate? And if there are concerns, then we wait and do it at a later meeting.
Unfortunately, that type of communication, because it is among the entire subcommittee and it's not simply regarding an administrative or kind of scheduling or logistical matter, it does need to happen in an open meeting, is my understanding. Sorry, I hate being the messenger.
Marion, I see your hand up. Is that a suggestion on options?
Well, just to follow up on Secretary Moore's suggestion, she was correct in identifying that the work we had originally identified for the agenda for the September 14th meeting won't be ready at that point. So there's a proposal for the steering committee to consider tomorrow to move that agenda of work to October 5th, which means we have time to hold perhaps a shorter meeting on the 14th as it was originally scheduled. And I think that could be an option for the subcommittee to have more time to consider that report and recommendations and do it on the 14th meeting. I think knowing that perhaps by the steering committee meeting tomorrow afternoon would be helpful. So that's something that they could consider and deliberate and decide whether or not to continue to hold that September 14th meeting. I think the original recommendation was to move the meeting to October 5th and cancel the 14th meeting. But if there's a need to have that 14th meeting and maybe keeping it shorter, that's something we could bring to the steering committee tomorrow. So just wanted to add that.
So maybe an option would be on the Monday meeting, since we did gain consensus on the social cost of carbon report and recommendations, we present that, but hold the GHG report review recommendations to a later date. But we could potentially at least provide an update on that topic on Monday, if not consensus recommendations.
Maybe Leslie Ann, can I ask, do you want more time with the entire memo, or to the extent we've sort of appear to have reached broad agreement on essentially page 1? Are you comfortable with that, but just would like the opportunity to actually review and consider any changes that are made to page 2?
Exactly.
So Jared, it may be that we could present then to the council the 5 elements that are contained on page 1 on Monday, and just let them know that we will frame it out as a memo with more detail to be brought to them in time for the September 14th meeting.
Sounds good to me.
With that plan in place, I'm going to leave this meeting, and you're probably going to lose a quorum when I do. I'm sorry, but I have to go.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you for staying longer than planned. With that, are we safe to adjourn? Co-chair Poor?
Well, one other item is that I think with the full council meeting next week, that we were going to cancel, Jared and I had talked about canceling next week's subcommittee meeting. Any objections to that? Don't think I will see any. Don't see any.
I'd really like another meeting, TJ.
I know, and 3 hours. So we will see you all in 2 weeks then, and Jared and I will work on an agenda with Jane and CBI for that meeting.
Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you.